Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Yoma Ayin Tet. Just reminding everyone the upcoming Siyum, please register if you're coming on the Zoom on July 11. And if you're in Israel and you want to register to one of the Siyumim, or if you're in one of our communities, I know a bunch of the different communities abroad are arranging Siyums among themselves. So please pay attention to details. If you're not part of our communities yet, please join one of our WhatsApp communities and you can contact women who are living in your area. We have a lot of different areas, so we might not get everybody, but hopefully you can find people who are not far from you. It's all on our website, on Hadron's site, on the front page. There's something called communities. You can link on there. If you want to register for the Siyum, it's on the homepage. If you want the Siyum in Israel, it's on the homepage of the Hebrew side. If the English Zoom, it's on the homepage of the English side. So lots of good shiurim will be on the Zoom, so please come and join. Okay, we are starting to learn Yoma Ayin Tet today. We're back away from the Agadato, back to basic halachic sugyot. We actually have a pretty simple, clear-cut sugya today, a little bit of a short daf after all those long ones. So here goes. Starting from the bottom of Ayin Chet Amud Bet. Ha'ochel kekotevet hagasa. Interesting that they don't quote the next word here. Okay, if you look back at the Mishnah, what were the words? It said, Ha'ochel kekotevet hagasa uchigar inata. Okay, in what case you chayav liable on Yom Kippur that you're going to get karet? If you eat the size of a date and its pit, at least that's the simple translation. Kamoha, right? Kamoha ukigarinata, it and its pit. So the Gemara's question in another minute or in another second is going to sound a little bit strange. The Gemara now asks, or Papa asks, by Rav Papa, ki kotevet sha'amru bigarinata or below garinata? When they said a kotevet, a date, did they mean, first of all, it said kotevet hagasa, pay attention. Gasa means large. Did they mean with the pit or without the pit? To which Rashi says, what kind of question is that? It said, kamoa ukigarinata. So, v'ha dekatani, look at Rashi, the first Rashi. Bigarinata u'shelo bigarinata. V'ha dekatani matnitin ukigarinata. As it already said, with the pit. So, mibayale hechi kamal. What he's asking is the following. Kamoa uchigarinata yachad. Did it mean the date with its pit together? O dilma hachi kamar. Kamoa o kigarinata. Or maybe it meant the date or its pit. Now, Tosfot jumps on Rashi and says, what are you talking about? In other words, Rashi is suggesting that maybe the way Rav Papa is reading the Mishnah is it could be read as the date or its pit, meaning a date without a pit or just the pit itself. Now, that would be very strange because if the Mishnah is trying to establish a requisite amount, usually they don't do a requisite amount in this or that, right? Either you're liable for this, the smaller amount, or not. So it doesn't make sense to give two shiurim, in which case that's a very strange question. Some of the other commentaries say that maybe what it means is there's two ways to read the Mishnah. And this is a bit of a creative interpretation. I would say the question is definitely much better than the answers. The question is a really good question. Possibly they had a different version of the Mishnah. Didn't say with the pit, I don't know. But in any case, it's difficult what the question is. But the other suggestion is that maybe it means you can have a date with a pit inside, or you can have a date with a pit outside. And the measurement, right? If you measure a date plus a pit, right? A date without a pit with a pit next to each other, that's one amount. What you're going to basically do is squish the date down, right? Until you get rid of all the air inside. And then you have a pit. That's one amount. If you have a date with a pit, there's usually a little airspace in between the pit and the date. So if you're saying a date with its pit inside, that's going to be a little bit of a larger amount because you're going to have some airspace in it. And that maybe that's the difference. Again, it's getting very nitty gritty details. Okay, I assume we're talking about volume here. It's a good question. Are we talking volume or weight? It's also a good question. I think it really means volume. In any case, it's a bit of a question. What exactly is the question? So now we're going to read the answer. We're actually not going to get an answer. He asked that question. By Rav Ashi, we're going to show that Rav Ashi asked a similar question in a different situation, a similar, I would say, type of question. Etzem kiseora. When we talk about laws of impurity, one of the measurements there is a bone is mitameh, the size of barley. Now, barley, when it says barley, does it mean biklipata, with its peel, or below klipata, or without the shell, I guess it really is a better interpretation, or without its shell. Bilecha, when it's moist, or biyevesha, or dried. Obviously, it's going to be different, right? When things dry, they're much smaller. If it has the klipa, it's going to be bigger. Rav Ashi, now they're going to point out that Rav Ashi lo mebaya lehad Rav Papa. Why did Rav Ashi ask the question that Rav Papa asked? We're now going to have, why did Rav Ashi ask it specifically on Etzem K'Seora and not on Rav Papa? And why did Rav Papa ask it there and not on the other case? Really, we're not going to have why they asked it specifically in their case, but the question is more, why didn't they ask the question the other one asked? So Rav Ashi didn't ask the question of Rav Papa because Gasa Itmar. It said Gasa, Kotevet Hagasa, large. Therefore, they're going to say Kol Kama de Gasa. Once we say large, what do we mean? We're going to mean as large as we can get it, meaning yes, it includes the pit. Obviously, it depends what the question is. Maybe it means yes, it includes the pit inside the date, if we're going to say according to that second interpretation I mentioned, which is the airspace is included as well. In other words, no matter what, we're going to err on the side of saying as large as it could be. And therefore, he didn't even ask the question because it was obvious to him. And we're going to see later that in one of the other sources we're going to quote that sometimes they say kotevet, which is just the date, not with the pit. So here it said kotevet agasa, it must mean large, meaning not just a large date, but including whatever else is included with it, including its pit. Rav Papa lo mebaya lehad Rav Ashi. He didn't ask about etzem k'seora for a very simple reason. Lecha shibolet mikre, shelo b'klipata ushla mikre. If you were talking about a moist barley, you wouldn't call it barley. You would call it shibolet. That's the word for the barley with the barley when it's moist. Shelo b'klipata is called ushla. In other words, the word barley already, when you use the word seora, what you mean is without its husk, and I'm sorry, with its husk and dried though. Okay, it's going to be dried with the husk. So basically, we're going to end up saying that's why Rav Papa didn't have a question by etzem k'seora, because the word seora is very clear what it means. And Rav Ashi didn't have a problem with the date because it said gasa. Gasa is very clear what it means. Why the other one wanted to ask is maybe more of a question, but the Gemara doesn't address that, and it also doesn't even address the answer to this, which is interesting, right? Rav Papa asked this, he doesn't get an answer, but it seems very clear that that's what it is. Amar Rav. Rava now says, Amar Rav Yehuda. He says in the name of Rav Yehuda. Okay, so it's Rava, but also saying Rav Yehuda's approach, which is we're now going to have the basic structure of today. It's a very, very clear structure. We have, as opposed to, some other studios we saw that were more long-winded, we now have we now have this issue of where does Kotevet Hagasa fit in with other shiurim that we know? Generally, if we talk about requisite amounts, the basic that we always go to, our go-to shiur is Kizayid, right? An olive bowl. Then when we get to a larger shiur, we usually go with a kibetza, an egg, right? The size of an olive, the size of an egg. Well, usually a kibetza is about double the size of an olive. So the question is, where does this Kotevet Hagasa fit in with those shiurim? Is it, right, we assume it's more than an olive because generally a date is bigger than an olive. How does it compare to the kibetza? It's not so clear to them. So we're going to have two different approaches. One is to say it's more than a betza, and one is to say it's between a kazayit and a betza. So Amar Rava, Amar Rav Yehuda. Kotevet Hagasa she'amru yetera mikibetza. This Kotevet Hagasa that we're talking about in Yom Kippur is larger than a kibetza, which I just want to point out. That means that you're not going to be liable to get karet unless you have this larger amount. It's going to be a more lenient approach here. Okay. Now, why would it be different, by the way, than normal eating? Well, because normal eating is, what is considered eating. Here, we have to get to, we've been talking about inoi, okay? And inoi is all about, how much, right? How much we're afflicted. In order to be afflicted, it's going to be a larger amount. You might eat a little bit and still be hungry, okay? And the question later, we'll see at the very end, how does this connect with what we call svi'ah, satiated, right? Which normally that comes up when it comes to Birkat Hamazon. We'll get to all that later. So now, so you can imagine that it could be larger than a kazayit. The question is, how much larger? So now we're going to have, okay, the structure is going to work like this. We have Rava who quotes Rav Yehuda's opinion. Then we're going to bring a question on this opinion. We're going to bring two answers. The first answer, we're going to give we're going to strengthen it, like a support for that. The second answer, we're going to have question on it. And then we're going to bring support for it. And then we're going to reject the support for it. Okay, that's going to be our structure till we get to the second opinion. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Kotevet Agasash Amru, or Amar Rav Yehuda, Kotevet is Yitera Mikibetza. V'kim lehu l'Rabbanan. Now we have to explain why, because the rabbis assumed and we're looking for Yishuv Hadat. What makes you feel good? To make you feel good when you eat, it has to be a larger amount, right? Often you eat and you're still hungry, right? You don't feel this, oh, wow, I really ate, right? You're still hungry. You eat more, you eat more, you eat more. So to get to Yishuv Hadat, that takes more than a kezayit, even more than a kibetza. But any less than that, lo miyat v'date, you're not really feeling complete, or I'm trying to think of how you would say Yishuv Hadat, but this complacency, this, wow, now I feel good about because I've eaten. So now here comes the first difficulty, or the difficulty on this opinion. I see people are satiated. Satiated, it wouldn't be. Satiated is sova. That's a different word. It's not the same. That's why it's hard to say. The settled is maybe a good word, Gita, like you're saying. It's different than satiated. That's the whole idea here. If it was satiated, we know from other sources, satiated is kibetza. So this seems to imply this is even more than satiated. Okay, which later, when we get to the other opinion is going to say, no way. How could you be satiated and not settled, right? They kind of go hand in hand, or maybe you get there before. Okay, so it's a little hard to find this word. I see people helping me, relieved, calmed, something, right? It's the opposite of afflicted, basically. They're trying the opposite word of that. Meitivin. So now we're going to bring in difficulty. A lot of the sources we're going to bring have to do with sukkah, because sukkah is an issue where at a certain requisite amount, you have to eat in the sukkah, right? You can eat less food outside the sukkah, a certain amount you have to eat in the sukkah. So again, we're going to get to these requisite amounts and what constitutes a meal, etc. So Ma'aseh Viu leRabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, this is a Mishnah in sukkah. They brought to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, lit'om et hatavshil, they gave him something to taste. And they brought Rabban Gamliel 2 dates and a pail of water. V'amru he'elum l'sukkah, and those rabbis told the people, go bring it into the sukkah. Here comes the important line. The Tanei Allah, there's a braita about this Mishnah which explains, lo mipnei halachakach, it's not because this is the halacha that they brought it into the sukkah. They wanted to be more stringent, but really, according to the base halacha, this did not require sukkah, not the tasting, and not, more importantly, our issue, obviously, the 2 dates. So now comes the Gemara and says, they continue now in the source. When they gave Rabbi Tzadok food that was less than a kibetza, less than the size of an egg, nitalo b'mapa, he put it in a mapa, okay, meaning he didn't touch it. This is an issue with netilat yadayim, and that he claims that it didn't need netilat yadayim. You didn't need to wash your hands, but you still shouldn't touch it directly. So he put it in a mapa because he thinks, we don't hold this way, that in order to wash, you need to be eating a kibetza. It's not, if you're going to only eat a kezayit, you don't need to wash. We hold you need to wash for kezayit. And even so, we wash without a bracha, even for eating a little bit. But he held that it didn't need it. And therefore, he held it with a mapa instead of touching it with his hands directly. Va'achalo chutz l'sukkah. He ate it outside the sukkah. Now, what is this? Less than a kibetza. He ate outside the sukkah. Below beirech hacharav, and he didn't say a bracha achrona, the bracha after eating, because he held, and there's a machloket about this, we'll see this later, that in order to say a bracha at the end of a meal, you have to have eaten a kibetza, which again goes with feeling satiated. So now, what do we see from here? Ha kibetza by sukkah. From the last line that we just read about Rabbi Tzadok, that he had less than a kibetza and didn't eat in the sukkah, what can you infer? More than a kibetza, you need to eat in the sukkah, right? Or a kibetza needs sukkah. Now, if a kibetza needs sukkah, so let's figure out, what do we have? They ate 2 dates outside the sukkah. That means 2 dates is less than a kibetza. Everybody follows? Because if 2 dates didn't require sukkah and they only did it as a stringency, and a kibetza requires sukkah, which was implied from the words of Rabbi Tzadok. Then, or the case of Rabbi Tzadok, who ate less than a kibetza outside the sukkah, meaning if it were a kibetza, he would have needed the sukkah. So, Isal Kadata, Kotevet Hagasasha Amru Yetera Mikibetza. If we want to assume that the Kotevet Hagasar in our Mishnah is larger than a kibetza, Hashta Shtei Kotavot Below Garinim, Lo Havi Kibetza, Kotevet Hagasar Garinata, Mi Havi Yetera Mikibetza. This is simple math. 2 dates without a pit, are they going to be, right? The assumption here is, let's just do it in order. Kizayit, 2 kotavot is bigger than a kizayit, 2 dates. Next shiur is kibetza, and the next shiur is kotevet agasa with its garin. Okay, a date with its pit. Now, the way we view dates, right? Our dates, if you have a date with a pit, it's going to be less than the size of 2 dates. And here, 2 dates was less than a kibetza. So simple math would say 1 date with its pit is less than 2 dates, which means it can't be more than a kibetza. Clearly here, the 2 kotavot were less than a betza because they didn't need to eat it in the sukkah. Okay, so that's our problem here. 2 answers to this question. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Actually, that's not such a question. Shtei kotavot below garinatan. Your math was wrong. 2 dates without pits, lo havi kibetza, is less than a kibetza, like we said. Kotevet agasa v'garinata, but a date with its pit, have 1 date plus a pit, is yitera mi kibetza. In other words, the pits are very large. 1 date plus 1 pit, okay, a pit is larger than the date itself. So 2 dates is actually less than 1 date with its pit. And that is the assumption. Obviously, he was eating 2 dates. He wasn't eating the pit. And there we're talking not about a size. We're talking about actual dates. He ate the dates. He obviously didn't eat the pit. So there it's clear. It's 2 dates without pits. And here it's a date with a pit. The pit is larger. And now we're going to have a proof, as I said, for this. And the proof is not from halacha, but from the way people speak and from an expression that people say. Amar Papa, Hainu da'amri inashe. This is what people say. Okay, it's just like a thing that people say. Trei kabe ditmare, chag kabe dikashiata usriach. 2 kavs, that's a measurement of volume. 2 kavs of dates is equal to 1 kav of kashiata, which are pits, and sriach, meaning 1 kav full of pits, okay, is and a little bit more is equal to 2 kav of dates. Okay, so the assumption, actually, maybe here, now I'm thinking about it, talk about volume. If it's 1 kav is a volume measurement, then maybe it does mean weight. But the weight of the pit is heavier. Maybe that's what we're talking about, weight, actually, now that I think about it. The point is here that you see that the pits are bigger, okay, in measurement, okay, whether we say maybe in weight, which maybe makes more sense, because pits are heavier than the dates themselves, or maybe their dates were different than our dates. In any case, this seems to be a proof for that approach, okay? So one answer, again, is that the 2 dates don't bother us because that's without the pit. This is our 1 date with the pit, and therefore we're talking about different things. Rava Amal. Rava says the premise of your question is wrong. Why? What did they do? They brought Rabban Gamliel 2 dates, and he ate them outside the sukkah. And from Rabbi Tzadok, we saw that they brought him food. It was presumably bread because we were talking about washing. And it was a kibetza that requires sukkah. Now you're comparing 2 different things. Fruits, in general, we're going to see this inside. Rav Amar, peri lo bai sukkah. You don't even need to eat fruits in a sukkah. It doesn't matter how many fruits you're eating. Fruits don't require sukkah, right? We know. What do you have to eat in a sukkah? Bread, mizonot, anything from the 5 grains. You don't need to eat fruits in the sukkah. The reason why they brought him 2 dates and he ate them in the sukkah only as a stringency was because dates don't require. It has nothing to do with the measurement of how many dates. That's an irrelevant detail, right? An irrelevant fact. Nothing to do with anything, in which case there's no difficulty there. So now we're going to question this assumption. Is it true that fruits really don't require sukkah? So the first thing, as I told you we're going to do, I told you this before, but now I'll repeat. Let's just go through the structure. We had an opinion. This opinion that Rava brought in the name of Rav Yehuda, that Kotevet Agasa U'Kigarinata is larger than a kibetza. Then we brought a contradiction that from sukkah, it seemed to indicate that it's not the same. Then, right, that it's smaller than, okay? To which Rabbi Yirmiyah said, no, smaller is 2 dates, but that's smaller than our date with a pit. Then Rava brings a different answer, which is fruits that require sukkah. What we're going to do with Rava's answer is we're going to bring a question, a difficulty. We're going to answer it. We're going to bring potential supports for the answers. Okay. Then, or a difficulty. First, we're going to bring a support for answer number 1. Then we're going to bring a difficulty on the second answer. And then, I'm sorry, no, I said that wrong. Let me fix that. Where I was looking at the wrong part of my sheet. Okay. So go back. Rava is the second answer. We're going to have a difficulty with 2 answers on it. Then we're going to bring a support for his answer, but we're going to reject the support. That's going to be our structure. So let's see it inside. Again, we're going to bring a source from Sukkah. Meitive. Amarad Rebbe. So the whole point is we want to prove that fruits, we're going to try to disprove Rava. He said fruits don't require Sukkah. We're going to show that fruits do need a Sukkah. Amar Rebbe, כשהיינו לומדים תורה אצל רבי אלעזר בן שמוע, when we were learning Torah with Rabbi Elazar ben Shema, הביאו לפנינו, they brought before us, תאנים וענבים, figs and grapes, ואכלנום אכילת ארעי חוץ לסוכה. There's 2 ways, before I explain this term, I want to explain what achilat arai is. You can eat in 2 different ways. We all know this. You could sit down at the table and eat a proper meal. You can also nibble in the kitchen, right? This happens all the time. You're in the kitchen, you go in, you're hungry, you open the fridge, you take something, you eat it, you move on. Then you go back, you take something, you nibble. That's called achilat arai. When you eat achilat arai, technically speaking, halachically, okay, we're not so careful about, we usually err on the more stringent side. Even if you're going to eat bread, achilat arai halachically, you don't really need to eat it in the sukkah. Okay, we generally, if you're going to wash on anything, right, you're going to eat it in the sukkah. Or you're going to snack on some crackers, you're going to eat them in the sukkah. But according to the Gemara, it seems like in order to be obligated in sukkah, you need a meal. It has to be, you're sitting, not just nibbling. So they say the following. They brought before Rabbi Elazar, right, when we were learning Torah with Rabbi Elazar ben Shema, they brought us some fruits and we ate them achilat arai chutz l'sukkah. We nibbled on them. We were just snacking. Because we were snacking, we ate it outside the sukkah. Now, what's the inference from here? The whole idea was, Rava said, Peyrot don't need sukkah. Well, this seems to say we ate them in a casual manner. If you're eating in a casual manner, that's why they weren't obligated in sukkah. That would imply, achilat arai because you were eating them casually, that's why. But achilat keva, lo. But if you ate them in a meal, let's say you decided I'm having a meal of fruits, right? Some people do this, let's say for breakfast. They eat a whole bowl of fruits, a fruit salad. If you ate that and that's your meal, you'd be required sukkah according to this. So how could Rava say Peyrot don't require sukkah? So we're going to have 2 explanations here to resolve this difficulty against Rava. Ema, you could say, achalnum ke'achilat arai chutz l'sukkah. We ate fruits, and even though we ate a lot of them, we ate them as if it was a casual eating outside the sukkah, because fruits are always, and fruits by definition is achilat arai. Even if you eat a big fruit salad, it's never really a meal. That's not a meal. A meal is not fruit salad. Even if you make it a meal and it's your meal, that doesn't, right? Other foods, yes, would be a difference between a meal or not a meal. But fruits, no matter what, even if you eat a ton of them, it's never considered a meal. It's like an eating of bread, achilat arai, outside the sukkah. Okay, so therefore it changes something minor, which is not achilat arai, ke achilat arai, like achilat arai. Ibaitema, achalnum achilat keva. Now this is a classic. It doesn't say these words, but chisur machasre v'hachi kefana. We're going to add a few words, as if a few words are missing here. When they said they brought us figs and grapes, and we ate them casually outside the sukkah, what he really meant was the following. Since arai has nothing to do with fruits, because fruits are always arai, it must mean something else. So what does it mean? Achalnum achilat keva. We actually had a meal full of figs and grapes. And at the same time, achalnu pat achilat arai. And we also had bread, but we had the bread in a casual manner. V'hadayu, together with those fruits, chutz l'sukkah. And because the fruits don't require sukkah no matter how much we eat them, and the bread we were only eating in a casual manner, we didn't have to eat any of this in the sukkah, and therefore we didn't go into the sukkah. And then it resolves our question against Rava, who said that fruits don't require sukkah, because here you see fruits really don't require sukkah. Okay, so that was, we brought Rava, who said, again, Rava was trying to resolve this contradiction about the 2 dates that Rabban Gamliel didn't eat in the sukkah, even though theoretically it's more than a kibetza. And he says, not like the first answer of Yomi, who tried to say, oh no, 2 dates is actually smaller than a date with its pit. Rava says, no, that's not necessarily the case. But it's a different issue, which is the fruits never require sukkah at all. Tried to bring a difficulty, but we resolved it. Now we're going to try to bring a proof for this approach. Lema Mesehele. Maybe this source will support it. Okay. Lefichach imishlim. We're in the middle of a sentence here, but I'll get back to the background here. Lefichach imishlim b'minei targima yatsa. Okay. This is the machloket in sukkah about whether you have to wash on every meal. Do you have to eat 14 meals in the sukkah? Let's say I eat a meal just of fruit. I decide for dinner I'm eating fruit. I don't have to eat it in the sukkah. So let's assume fruits don't require sukkah. Do I actually have to eat a meal? Or let's say I have a steak and potatoes, which theoretically don't need sukkah. Do I have to have 14 meals in the sukkah, two a day? Is there a requirement? Rabbi Eliezer says there is a requirement. Tanakama says, no, you don't. You could decide if you don't want to eat. The requirement is if you're eating, you have to eat in a sukkah, but there's no requirement to make sure to have 14 meals in the sukkah, 2 a day. Those days they only ate 2 meals a day, other than Shabbat. And there's a question there about should be 15, because what about Shabbat? You need 3 meals. Anyway, that's not our issue right now. What if you did it? So according to him, you have to make up a meal. How do you make up a meal? You can't eat 3 meals on a day. You normally eat 2 meals. So once you eat, you're not going to eat another meal. So they say you can be mashlim b'minei targim. If you're mashlim, this is kind of it's a makeup meal. How do you do a makeup meal when you just ate a meal? So you can't eat another whole meal. So you can eat what we call minei targima. Okay. Unclear what exactly minei targima is. There's a very important sugya, by the way, for Sudash the sheep. Okay, when we're required to eat 3 meals on Shabbat. Now, many people struggle with the 3rd meal because you've eaten 2 big meals. It's very hard to eat another meal. We talked about this when we learned about Sudash the sheep in Shabbat. The issue is the 3rd meal, there's a whole hierarchy of what you can eat instead. So ideally, you should have lechem mishnah, 2 rolls or 2 loaves of bread. If you don't have that, like all the other meals of Shabbat, if you don't have that, you can go down to 1 whole loaf or a whole roll. If you don't have that, you can have a slice of bread. If you don't have bread at all, or you don't want to eat bread because you're very full, so what do? You eat what we call minei targima. It comes from here. Because by sukkah, it can be used as a makeup meal. Therefore, the rabbis learn from here also to Sudash the sheep that you can use minei targima. Now, the problem is, and here you're going to see it from our sugya, nobody really knows what minei targima is. The assumption is it's some sort of dessert, something you eat after your meal. And therefore, it could be something sweet. It could be something, it could be mizonot. It could be not mizonot. It's not clear what it is. Some people say it's fish and meat. Some people say it's fruit. We don't really know what it is. And therefore, there's a hierarchy in halacha, and it all comes from this sugya, which is, and also the sugya in sukkah where it appears, which is what exactly you're supposed to eat. So ideally, it should be mizonot. If not mizonot, then you can go, fish and meat. If not fish and meat, then fruit. Okay, that all comes from how exactly do we define minei targima. So right now, the Gemara is assuming, and we'll see in a second, Isal kadatach peri bai sukkah. If you thought that fruits required sukkah, then fruits could count for your meal. And then they're assuming right now, minei targima does not include fruit. And therefore they say, litni perot. It should have just said, lefichach mishlim b'perot. They should have chosen the most simple thing, the lightest, the easiest. Easiest would be to say, eat fruit. Okay, because many people eat fruit at the end of their meal. So eat fruit. And fruit, that would be it. Since it says minei targima and not fruit, what does that seem to imply? It can't be used to fill in your meal, meaning fruit doesn't require sukkah, because theoretically, anything that requires sukkah could be eaten as a meal, and requires to eat in a sukkah should count as a meal. So therefore, it should have said perot. It doesn't. So what do you see here? This would be a support for Rava that fruits aren't required. You're not required to eat fruits in a sukkah. But the Gemara rejects this for 2 reasons. My minei targima pehot. You could simply say that minei targima means fruit. Who's to say we don't know what minei targima is? Minei targima potentially could mean fruit. This is, by the way, really interesting. Halachically, I told you a minute ago that you can use fruits for Sudash l'shit if you don't have other things, or you don't want to eat other things, and all you're in the mood for is fruit. Now, it never says that minei targima is fruit. This is just the Gemara suggesting as a way to say, don't use this as a proof. maybe minei targima means fruit, and from there comes the halacha that since potentially minei targima could mean fruit, therefore one could eat fruit for tzudash l'shit. It explains, right? It's very interesting because it means that when they're pushed into a corner and or they want to say you don't necessarily really have a proof from here, and they suggest something, sometimes those suggestions become halacha. Okay. Now it also explains why fruit is the last of the list, because it's not clear that minei targima really means perot. So it's our last resort, but it is a last resort. So it's very interesting in terms of how halacha comes out of the Gemara. We have a short doc. We could go off on other things. Okay. Alternatively, you could say, it was a place where they didn't have fruits. So they said, fill in with minei targima and make up your meal. Use it to make up with minei targima. They didn't just say fruits just because maybe it was a place that didn't have fruits, right? It's very rare you have a place without fruits, but it does happen. Places don't have fruits. I've been once in a while, you go to a shuk, right? You assume you can always get fruits and vegetables. I remember one time I was in a place where there was literally the only thing I found were some really bad tomatoes, and that was it. They had nothing in the shuk. So it could happen where you go to the market and there's really no fruit, right? Hard to imagine in our day and age, but it really does happen in some places. And certainly then you could have been in a place where fruits just don't grow there. So maybe they didn't talk about fruits because it wasn't something people really ate. Okay. So therefore you can't just prove it from this line. It's a good, right? One is a halachic reason that fruits are minei targima. One is or you could even say a definition. One is just practically, the reason they used that word was just because that was something that was typical to use. So they used something typical and not something atypical. That was our first opinion of Rava in the name of Rav Yehuda, that kotevet hagasa is more than a kibetza. Now we're going to see the approach that kotevet hagasa is less than a kibetza, and this is actually how we paskin on Yom Kippur, that it's in between a kazayit and a kibetza. Rav Zvi Rama, kotevet hagasa she'amru chasera mikibetza, it's less than a kibetza. How do we know this? The structure is going to be very simple. We're going to bring a proof. We're going to reject the proof, and then we're going to bring a different proof, and that's going to be where we end today. Ditnan, as it says in the following Mishnah, Beit Shammai Omrim. This is an approach of Beit Shammai about, we're going to talk about seor and chametz. Remember, seor is like the sourdough that it causes other things to rise as well, right? And a sourdough starter. And chametz is the chametz itself, which can't cause other things to leaven. So here goes. Beit Shammai Omrim, seor b'kazayit, chametz b'kikotevet. So the amount that you're liable for eating chametz and seor is different because seor can cause other things to leaven. Therefore, that's going to be a smaller amount. That's a kazayit. Chametz is b'kikotevet. The amount for chametz, we don't know this shita because it's Beit Shammai. We don't hold this one. But chametz is the kotev. And they asked a question. My time is Beit Shammai. What's the reason for Beit Shammai? The reason is like this. The Torah should have just said chametz and not seor at all. And what? If chametz was a kazayit and seor was a kazayit, if it said don't eat chametz, you would know that you can't eat a sourdough starter either because that's a leavening agent and that's more severe. So, Ana Amina, we would say, Uma chametz she'en chimutzo kasher. Chametz is not very, right, it can't really leaven other things. So therefore, we're going to say it's a sorba kazayit. And I'm sorry, therefore, we're going to say if that's a sorba kazayit, because that's general eating, seor shechimutzo kasher lo kol sheken. So a leavening agent, which is all the more so stringent, of course it'll be a shiur b'kazayit, an olive bulk. Therefore, midei palginu rachmana, but the fact that the Torah lists them separately, if you remember, we learned these psukim in Pesachim, right? It says don't eat chametz, it says don't eat seor. It lists these as two separate things. What does that teach you? It's to teach that each one has a different requisite amount. Otherwise, there would be no reason to accept both. So we're going to assume the first one is kazayit, chametz, and the seor, and chametz is a larger amount. Seor b'kazayit, chametz b'kikotev. Now, what does this have to do with us? Well, let's think. If you want to say like the other guy, the kotevet hagasa is larger than the kibetza. Beit Shammai is basically saying, since they're listed separately, one is going to be a larger shiur than the other, right? Chametz is going to be larger. Now, if you're going to say larger, you're going to go up one level. You're not going to go up two levels. If it's kazayit, kibetza, kikotevet, you're not going to skip kibetza and go to kotevet. you're going to say the Torah lists both. So instead of a kazayit, we'll make it a kibetza. So therefore, it makes sense, according to my opinion, that you go from kizayit, kikotevet agasa, kibetza, right? The kotevet agasa is in the middle. And that's why chametz b'kikotevet, and not a kibetza. So that proves my approach. But now the Gemara is going to reject this. And furthermore, sorry, I forgot to say there's another reason. Let's say the next year up is a kotevet, but also a kibetza. Maybe they're equal. Maybe it's just another word for the same requisite amount, which you might say, why would they do that? But we know that things developed in different places, and one person called it a kibetza and one person called it a kotevet. And therefore, right, they're using everyday items. The fact that we chose a kibetza and not a kotevet. So maybe they're the same. But nine kibetza, if they're the same, we should have used a kibetza, because a kibetza is something we use all the time, right? We haven't heard so much about this kotevet. It's not a typical requisite amount. They should have used the more typical one. So therefore, either kotevet is less, and that's why it got chosen, because it was the next one up on the list, and it's less than a kibetza, or it's the exact same thing, in which case they should have used the kibetza. So therefore, I must be right. Or at least the Gemara is trying to prove it from here. So therefore, elalav shmamina kotevet putami kibetza. Must be kotevet is less than a kibetza. So now the Gemara rejects this and says, no, mimai, why do you think that? Dilma la'olam emalacha kotevet agasa shambulu yitera mikibetza. Maybe really kotevet agasa is more than a kibetza. Hastama kibetza. Wait, there's a difference between a kotevet agasa, which was what appeared in our Mishnah, a large date, and notice this said chametz b'kikotevet. So now let's go. Kizayit, okay, we start with an olive bulb. We go up to a kotevet, a date. We go up from there to a kibetza, and we go up from there to kotevet agasa, a large date. So we basically go through, we're trying to compare apples and oranges. Not exactly, but, right? Crab apples and big apples, or, we're taking a date and comparing it to a large date. That's obviously not the same. So therefore, we're going to say that's not necessarily a good proof. And regarding your second question, what's that, right? Our second question is, maybe you want to say it's equal to a kibetza. You could just say, yeah, you chose to use a kotevet. Really, right? You think a kibetza is used more frequently, but that doesn't mean someone can't call it a kotevet if they want to. So maybe it's really the same, in which case this source doesn't prove anything. So back to square one, we want to try to prove Rasvid. We're going to bring, this is our last source for today. Let's learn it from here. Adkama mizamni. Okay, this goes back to our issue of satiated and how similar Yishuv dad is to satiated. Adkama mizamnin. At what point do you need to do a zimun, which really means you need to say berkana mazon? How much do you eat in order to require the grace after meals? Ad kizayit to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says a kizayit, okay, an olive oil. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad kibetza. You need a kibetza, you need a larger shiur in order to be required to do berkana mazon. So now, what's the root of their machlok? Rabbi Meir Savar, the famous pasuk this comes from is v'achalta v'savata uve'erachta. You eat, you're satiated, and you bless. So Rabbi Meir reads this pasuk is achalta zo achila, v'savata zo shtia. To tell you have to make a blessing after meals if you eat, and you have to make a blessing after meals if you drink. The extra word v'savata comes to include drinking as well. V'achila b'kizayit. And what is achila? V'achalta is what requires you to say berkana mazon on food. Right? Shtia would require you to say some other blessing, not berkana mazon. We don't say berkana mazon on drinking, but it requires you to say some blessing after the meals. But achila means any kind of eating is always, the basic is kizayit. So therefore, Rabbi Meir says it's kizayit. The Rabbi Yehuda savar ba'achalta v'savata achila sheyesh basfiya. It's an achila that has satiation. So is a kibetza, right? What is this? It's a kibetza. Now, that's how he gets to kibetza, because kibetza is satiated. So here's going to come in. If it's going to be more than a kibetza, how can you possibly be satiated? This is why I was trying to be careful to figure out what this terminology is, because it's clearly different. Satiated is kibetza. Yishuv dat is kikotevet agasa. Now, how can you possibly be satiated and say, I'm satiated, but I don't have this yishuv hadat? I'm not in a comfortable place, satiated, complacent, calm, right? It can't possibly be. If I'm satiated, then I obviously have yishuv hadat. Elalav shmamina. Therefore, we must assume כותבת הכסה שאמרו פחות מכבצע, כבצע מסבה, ככותבת מיית ודעתה. It must be less. You can't possibly get to the level of satiation without having what we call Yishuv Hadat. And therefore, we're going to say, see, thank you, Ruth is helping me. One's mind is at ease. Okay, that's another way to say it from the Schottenstein. Your mind would be at ease at a certain level, and higher than that, right, you're going to already be satiated. So therefore, we're assuming that's Rav Zvi's proof that Kotevet Hagasat comes before Kibetza, and it's in between a Kazayit and a Kibetza. So we saw two different approaches here, whether it's more or less than a Kibetza, and we saw proofs or attempts to prove each side. With that, we'll finish for today, and we'll continue on a little more about Shiurim tomorrow. Have a great day.